one of the things that I've learned over the years in my own study of the Bible and also as a pastor is that it's easy to come across an idea in the Bible that we kind of get and we like it conceptually, but we have a hard time figuring out how to actually put it in practice. It's this idea that we like it, we know it's right, but we don't know what it actually looks like in day-to-day lives. Let me give you a couple simple examples. I remember a number of years ago, I was at a Bible study, and the theme of the Bible study was talking about David's life, and that week it was really talking about the passage where it says that David was a man after God's own heart. And I remember, afterwards, everybody's talking about, boy, we need to be a people after God's own heart. Boy, we need to do that. And everybody was really encouraged. And it was a great Bible study until someone asked a question. Someone said, but what does it mean to be a man after God's own heart? What's that look like? And it totally ruined the Bible study. Because, we're all excited about it, but we had no clue what it actually meant. And, sometimes you have this idea and we like it, but we don't know how to apply it. Let me give you another example with my kids. I remember, again, a number of years ago at my last church, they did a vacation Bible school, and they did something called the Wordless book. And this is something that was put out initially by Child Evangelism Fellowship, and it uses this little book with colors to tell the story of the gospel. And so it starts off with this gold page, and it says we were created for a relationship with God. And then it goes to the dark page to say that we're all sinners and we're cut off from that relationship with God because of our sin. And then you go to the red page to talk about Jesus' blood and that he died on the cross to pay the penalty of our sin. And then the white page, because if we ask Jesus to forgive us, God washes our sin away and that we're made pure before him. And then it goes to the gold page. Then we know that we have a relationship with God, and one day we can be in heaven with him. And on the outside, you have the cover of green, which means if you have that relationship with him, God wants us to grow in that relationship. And now, I knew that this was being talked about with our kids. And so when they got back, I said, well, what did you think? What did you learn today? And I remember one of my kids, they're young preschool, and they answered, well, we did the Wordless book, and we learned that Jesus died on the cross for our sins, and then he turned black and red and white and gold and green. You're like, okay, you got the content, but I don't think you got the application. You got the meaning. Now I joke about those examples because I think the passage we're looking at last week, that we looked at last week, is an example of one of the passages that we can study and that we get, and we like the idea, but it's hard to know how to actually apply to our lives. See, the idea that we talked about last week is this idea of the inside-out nature of gospel transformation. How are our lives changed through our relationship with Jesus Christ? A couple weeks ago, we looked at the end of chapter 2, and Paul talked about legalism and how legalism focuses on the external, trying to change behavior by rules. And it's easy to focus on the external. That's what we see in our behavior. And if we just do the rules and if you do this, then you're going to change your behavior. But the problem is never our behavior, it's our heart. My ultimate problem is not my sinful action, it's my sinful heart. And our sinful actions are just the natural and inevitable expression of sinful thoughts and desires. And so too often we try to win the battle by the external. We try to change our behavior through self-control, but it's an approach that is powerless to actually change us. That's what Paul said in Colossians 2:23. The rules, the legalism, have an appearance of wisdom. It sounds right, in promoting a self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. They don't actually do anything. They're bound to fail because all it does is it changes the outside. All it does is it tries to keep us from doing the things we really want to do, and sooner or later, our defenses are going to be down and the real me is going to come out. What we need is transformation, an inside-out transformation, not trying to stop the thing that's in me, but to change the part that's in me. See, what I need to realize is that my problem is my heart, and my only hope is for my heart, my thoughts, my mind, my feelings, desires to be changed. That's what Paul talks about. Then we saw last week, Colossians 3:1-2. He said this, if you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on the things that are above, not on the things in the earth. If you really have this relationship with God, then seek the things, desire the things that are above. Change your desires, change your mind. See, because what it's saying is that if God changes our thoughts and our desires, the inside part of us, then the outside, the behaviors will naturally change. because we always act in a way that's consistent with what we really believe and what we desire. So change the inside, the outside will change. Now here's the idea. So we can look at that and we say, okay, I get it, I like it, I agree. But still we can struggle with practically, how do I do this? You see, oh yeah, you're telling me to change my inside out, my thoughts and my feelings, but the reality is that I'm facing flesh and blood struggles, a practical reality. You see, I'm dealing with the temptation of walking out on my marriage. I'm dealing with the temptation of fudging on the reports of work to cover up where I'm failing. I'm losing the battle and the daily temptation of the thing that I'm addicted to. I'm struggling with the fact that I just can't forgive the person that's hurt me so deeply. Those are practical realities. So how do I do that? How do I change the inside from the inside out when my reality is the outside? That's the struggle that I'm facing. Now, what the beautiful thing is that Paul gives us this idea in the verses we looked at last week, and now he says, we're going to see in the verses we're looking at today, is he then says, here's how you do it. Here's a practical expression of how you do it. And what he does is he says, okay, what you need to do is start with the understanding that the real problem is in the heart and mind. It's not primarily a behavior problem. It's who you are and it's who I am. But then we have to, once we understand that, we have to learn to track our behavior back through its thoughts and feelings, through the roots, so that we understand sin at its root, and then we try to attack it at the root level. See, that's where he says that's what we need to do. We need to understand this. The verses that we're looking at this morning, verses 5 through 10 of Colossians 3, Paul gives us a couple examples of doing this. He takes a couple areas of sin, and he says, okay, now let's take this sin and let's track it back to the root. Let's track it back to the thoughts and desires and the things that drive it. And then once you understand that, if you're struggling with this sin, then what you need to do is you need to understand the root and attack it there. Now, the first example that he gives us is the example of sexual sins. We see this in verse 5. In fact, I was going to say, if you have your Bibles open, you turn here, and we're going to look here. But I'm going to even put this on the screen because I want you to see something here. If we look at this, is that my microphone that's doing that? I don't know if our sound people are, Okay, thank you. I want you to look at the passage here. It says, put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you. Sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Now, what it may look like at first is that he's giving us a list of sins. He says, okay, now put to death all these bad things, and here's this list of sins, and they primarily seem to be sexual in nature. But that's not at all what he's doing. What he's actually doing here is he's saying, let's look at a group of sins. Sexual immorality. And this broad group of sins, and he says, now if you understand that you struggle with any kind of sexual immorality, then what you need to do is you need to track it back to its thoughts and desires. So we're going to see impurity, wrong thinking, going to passion and evil desire, wrong feeling, and ultimately rooted in the wrong heart of covetousness. So he identifies the act of sin and then shows it how that it flows from a sinful heart and mind that is focused on the wrong things rather than Christ. So let's look at this. Okay, first of all, what is the sexual act? The sexual act, our sinful action is sexual immorality. It's a very broad word. It's a word, Greek word porneia, from which we get our English word pornography. And it's a Greek word that speaks for all sexual sin, all sexual activity outside of marriage. So it's adultery, but it's not just talking about that. And it's fornication or sex between people that are unmarried. It's homosexuality. It includes all sexual intercourse outside of biblical marriage of one man and one woman. It's not only the act of sex; it's sexual content. So that's where you get into pornography and involved in it's not an affair. Yeah, but it's consistent with this. It's sexual activity outside of marriage. Sometimes you'll have young people that will say, well, we're not having sex. It's oral sex. Well, no, that's covered here as well. It's any inappropriate sexual contact out of marriage. Now, I want to make a comment here because this is a place where some people would look at it and say, well, okay, yeah, you talk about that. The Bible's anti-sex and God is anti-sex. And people have that impression, but that's not at all the case. To anyone who thinks that, I want to tell you, you need to realize that sex is God's idea. In fact, if you look at it, God created sex back in Genesis 1 and 2. God created it in the very beginning. He created it. He called it good. It's not a dirty thing. It's God's idea. Go back to Genesis 1 and 2. What do you have? God created Adam and Eve, and he put them in the garden naked. They didn't have any clothes. They didn't get any clothes until Genesis 3. You got clothes because of the fall. I mean, that wasn't God's idea. I mean, God says this is a good thing. He says, be fruitful and multiply. In fact, there's a whole book in the Bible, the Song of Songs, where it extols the wonders of sexual love within the bounds it was created for. It's this wonderful blessing given to us by God. But the Bible also tells us that while there's this wonderful blessing within the bounds it was created for, sex is a very powerful thing, and when you take it outside of those boundaries, it can do an incredible amount of damage, both to ourselves, our own souls, to our families, to those around us. And so therefore, God puts these parameters around sex, not to inhibit our joy, but to protect it from us so that we would enjoy fully what it was created for. He says if you go outside of this, there might be moments of pleasure, but ultimately there's going to be frustration. And what you need to realize is that, that these are things that God gives us as protections. It's God's idea. It's given to a gift for us, for our joy and for our pleasure. And so we need to reclaim that. It's not a negative thing. And so what he's saying is not speaking against sex, it's speaking against sex outside of God's design. God's created us as sexual beings. He's given us this gift as mankind. But he says if you go outside of those bounds, it's destructive. Now, our culture is redefining what those bounds are. In fact, I think our culture is kind of taking those bounds off and saying, well, it's whatever you want. We have this idea there are very few things that culturally we define as sexually immoral. But again, we're talking about creation. God created us. He created sex. He created all these things. And when he created us, it works when it works when you use it well. We use this illustration. It's like you have your car, and when you put gas in, it runs well. When you put anything else in the gas tank, it doesn't run well. And God says, okay, here's the owner's manual. When you do it the right way, it works well. When you don't, it doesn't work well. And it doesn't matter if everybody in the culture is changing the definition and calling things that God calls evil good. It doesn't change because God doesn't change. Our human nature hasn't changed. Our created design hasn't changed. So he says, okay, so the problem is sexual immorality. Any sex, when we take sex outside of the bounds of God's design. But the struggle isn't just with that behavior. You see, why do we struggle with sexual immorality? Because we have wrong thoughts, sinful thoughts. So it says, what is our problem? Sexual immorality, which comes from impurity. See, impurity is when we have impure thoughts. What he's talking about is a question of where do we focus our mind. It's not just it's not just a question of what we've done, but our thoughts and desires. Think about in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus explains this. Look what he says in Matthew 5. You have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, anyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Here's Jesus saying, you've heard it said, it's just about the behavior. And I'm saying, no, what drives the behavior is the thought. And if you have the wrong thought, then you're already sinning. And sooner or later, the wrong thought is going to lead to the wrong behavior. If we control our thoughts, we'll control our emotions, we'll control our body. If we don't control our thoughts, it's going to lead us out of control. But we have trouble controlling our thoughts because we have desires. So it's not only now, in sexual morality and the wrong thoughts, but then he talks about, again, verse 5, passions and evil desires. And he deals with our desires at this point. See, it's not just our thoughts, it's our desires. And our thoughts come from our desires. They flow from those desires. When it says passion there, it could also be translated lust, but also could be natural desires. The fact is it, again, is it wrong that we have sexual desire? No. God created us that way. But what happens is that natural desire becomes a passion. Something that is good becomes a passion so that it becomes something driving to us. It becomes something that we think about all the time. It becomes something that God has created to be a blessing in this scope, and suddenly it grows much bigger. And again, that's what you see now happening, is you have people that literally, their number one identity of who they are is they'll talk about their sexual passion. And they think that's the thing that defines them. You see, that's where you have a natural desire that has grown out of proportion. And it's become a passion, it's become an evil desire. And not only that, when you look at that, you say, okay, where does that all come from? All of it comes from, here he says, covetousness. Now you might look at this and you say, covetousness, that doesn't seem to be the sexual sin. In reality, what we've got to realize, it's the heart of all sinful thought and desire. It's at the core of all of our sexual struggle. And what is covetousness? It's a desire to have more than God has given us. Covetousness, again, we don't think of something that is a core problem, but it's saying, here's what God has given me, here's what's forbidden. I'm not content with what God has given me. I want what he hasn't given me. It says, God, I'm not happy with what you've given me. My heart is not happy and content, not only with what you've given me, but therefore, I'm not content with you. Not only am I not content with what you've given me, but therefore you're not trustworthy. So I'm going to reject your word, your principles in my life, and I'm going to go outside of that to get what I want. See, ultimately, what does he say? It's covetousness, which is idolatry. Because why is it idolatry? Because at the core, covetousness rejects God and then puts ourselves in the place of God. It says, God, because you haven't given me what I want, therefore, I'm going to go outside of that. I'm going to do what I want. I'm going to be the rule keeper in my life. I'm going to be my own God on this issue. See, ultimately, that's what it is. If you want to understand it more, that's the original sin. Go back to Genesis 3. You know what the original sin was? It was covetousness. It was Satan coming to him saying, you've got the whole garden, right? But God kept the best tree from you. And suddenly Adam and Eve lose sight of this incredible garden blessing that they have, and they suddenly say, well, God hasn't given me everything. I want what God hasn't given me, and not only do I want that, but I'm now doubting whether God's really good. So instead of saying God knows best and I'm going to do what God says, I know best and I'm going to make my own rules. When we think about all sexual sin, it comes down to that root. It always comes down to that root. See, either we're going to worship God and we're going to put him first and we're going to see things from a heavenly perspective and realize this is what God has given me in this stage of my life and I'm going to enjoy it, I'm going to bless it, I'm going to be thankful for it, or I'm going to say he hasn't given me and I want what he hasn't given me. And because he hasn't given me this, I think that the Bible is out of date, or I think that God just doesn't understand me, and you know what? I'm going to reject God's leadership in my life and I'm going to make myself God. So you see that. What's he doing? Is he's tracking it back. Do we struggle with sexual sin? Yes. Well, it's because of our sinful actions flow from our thoughts, which flow from our desires, which ultimately at the root flow from a covetousness, which rejects God because he doesn't give us all the things we think we need. We think we know better. Now that's the first example. The second one we're going to do a lot more quickly because we're going to spend more time on it next week. It's in verses 8 and 9. It's talking about relational sin, sins of our speech. Look at verse 8 and 9. Now you must put them away. Anger, wrath, malice, slander, obscene talk from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you've put off the old self with its practices. Now the big difference with this is he reverses the order. So before he started with the action and he moved back down to the thoughts and desire and the core. And here he starts with the core and he moves back to the action. So look what he says. He says, where does it start? First of all, put away anger. And anger more than anything else is the core. That's the core. When we deal with all relational problems, why do we have relational problems? Because we have anger. We have an unresolved issue with another person. Every relational problem we have goes back to that. And a lot of times we have something, we don't think of a big deal about it. We think, oh, it's not a big deal. But you know what? Whenever we don't resolve a problem, it's always going to eventually lead to other problems. And we're going to see more of this next week. Ephesians 4 talks about when we don't deal with anger, it gives the devil a foothold. So we start with anger, the core problem, and that leads to malice, sinful desires. That's this desire that we have to, to hurt someone, it's a desire to get back. Sometimes it's just the emotion. So we have hatred towards that person, disgust, indifference toward the person, or maybe sometimes it's what causes us to explode. Because when we have anger, it leads to desires, it leads to emotions. And that leads to what he then says is malice, our sinful thoughts. Malice is when we not only have a feeling, but we think about it. That person something bad happened to him. We kind of like it that something bad happened to him. We think about, what they deserve, and they deserve, I hope they get what they deserve. And we have these negative thoughts. And sometimes those negative thoughts get into action. ran across a story recently that was a good example of malice. A lot of banks, you can buy checks that, there's scenic backgrounds in the back or something like that. And one check in California, or one bank in California, for an extra fee, they allowed a customer to bring a personal photograph and then have that printed on the check. And a very imaginative and vindictive and guy with malice ordered a special set of checks solely for his alimony payments. It was a picture of him kissing his new and beautiful wife. Now that's malice. That's that person. How do I get at you? See, but when our hearts and minds start with anger and then they go to, desires of wrath and then thoughts of malice, what happens? It leads into action, slander, obscene talk, lying. Slander, it's harmful speech. It's not necessarily things that are even wrong. So a lot of times people think of slander as something that's untrue. It may be true, but it's hurtful. It tears other people down. When it says obscene talk, it could be not only cursing, but it could be abusive language. Lying. We're lying because we have problems in relationship with trust people. And all those things flow from those core actions and attitudes. So that's what he said. If you want to understand this, the challenge is understand what's your area of sin and then track it back. And realize that you need to deal with the root. Because what happens if we don't? If we don't deal with this sin, if we don't deal with it at the root, eventually it will bear fruit. It will bear fruit not only of sin, but of its destruction. Look what he says in verse 6. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. When he says, when you look at this, and if you don't deal with this, then the wrath of God will come. And when you look at what does that mean, I don't think he's again talking to believers here, and I don't think he's necessarily saying, well, God's going to come and judge you and send you to hell. You're going to lose your salvation. I think what it means is something of what is talked about in Romans chapter 1. Several times in Romans 1, it says that they made these choices and God gave them over to their sin. And here's what it's saying, is that if you don't deal with these things seriously, if you don't deal with the sin at its root, sooner or later we will go into the sin and it will catch up to us and we will face the consequences. I can't play with sin and not in time feel the consequences. It's a kind of idea that, you think about a parent that tries to teach their children. They want to smoke. And you say, oh, you want to smoke? Here, let me give you a big, heavy, go ahead and breathe deeply. You're trying to teach, here's the consequences. You're trying to say, stay away from that because there's negative consequences. And God's saying, understand, there are always consequences. It's what James says in James chapter 1. Look what he says. Let no one say when he's tempted, I'm being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil. And he himself tempts no one, but each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Now, it's the same idea that he said in verse 12 and 13. He said, or 13 and 14, understand that if you nurture the thoughts and the feelings, eventually it's always going to result in action. And then if it results in action, always realize that sin, when it's fully grown, brings forth death. There is always consequence. There is always the wrath of God. And so we look at this and we say, this is a serious thing. So what do we need to do? What he calls us to do is he calls us to have what I'm going to call ruthless grace. Now you look at that and you say, those words don't belong together. But in the context of what we see here, they really do. Go back to verse 5. Look what he says. Therefore, put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, covetousness, which is idolatry. When it says put to death, it literally, therefore, murder. It's a violent, ruthless word. And he calls us to say we've got to realize that the problem we have and the approach is to be ruthless. To literally, in ruthlessness, to murder sin. And not only to murder sin at the core, but to try to get it at its roots. If we realize that we have a relationship with Christ, we should realize that we are a new person. We've been made alive to Christ, and we're made alive to Christ, and we want to live for him. And the old part of us, the sin nature, the things that we did, they don't belong anymore. And it shouldn't be something that I should look back at and say, oh, that was great and fun when I did it, or boy, I still have some of this. We should realize that no, that if I follow Christ, that I should have a ruthlessness that says that the sin that I have, I want to kill it, I want to murder it, I want to destroy it, because it has no place in my life. But here's the key, is that we realize that it's not just the sin, but it's the root of the sin. See, ruthless grace is one that hates the thought of sin as much as the action. See, a lot of times we have to question, first of all, do you hate the sin in your life? See, a lot of times we may hate the sin, but deep down we kind of like the thoughts. We kind of like the feeling. You know, I don't want to fall into sexual immorality. I know that that's wrong. But you know what? I kind of like that relationship. Even though it's not a biblical relationship, I kind of like flirting with that person. I like getting on Facebook and kind of flirting with that person that's not my spouse. I enjoy that. You know, I know it's wrong, and I'm not going to do sexual immorality, but, you know, looking at porn as an escape every once in a while, I kind of enjoy it. I know it's wrong to gossip, but it feels good. See, we can hate the sin, but then we can nurture the thought and the desire. We know it's wrong, but it's really not sin. It's not like I'm committing adultery or anything. The thing is, he says, yeah, it is. And are you willing to admit to God that this is wrong, and this is something that God, it needs to die? Not only that the sin needs to die, but the desire, the thoughts need to die. You know, it's hard to do that because, number one, I don't want to admit that my problem is that deep. I want to just make it, again, the legalism, it's just the behavior. No, it's not about the behavior. It's my thoughts, it's my heart, it's my attitude. And God needs to kill something a whole lot deeper in me if my behavior is really going to be changed. That's hard to admit. We are really that broken. I even talked to somebody last week, and he was saying, you know, am I that bad? And I said, yeah, you are. So am I. You know, I deserve to go to hell. You know, that's part of the Christian life. It's realizing that my heart is that sinful, and I need to surrender it to Christ. Because until I fully admit my brokenness, he can't fully heal me. See, but second of all, one of the problems is that for many of us, these thoughts and feelings are escapes that we train ourselves to run to. I know I don't like it, but it's a medication. You know, so that when things are hard or when I'm lonely, you know, what do? Well, I run to that medication. I run to that thought. I run to that temptation. I go there and I kind of medicate myself. And if I really kill that, what's going to meet my need when everything else seems empty? See, what I found is that there are a lot of people that really, they might be willing to put sin to death, but we're not willing to put the thoughts, we're not willing to put the desires, the core issues to death. We don't really want it to die. And here's what happens is that we have periods of time where we know victory over that sin, and boy, we're living great. And next thing you know, it pounces on us and it destroys us. And we're like, how in the world did that happen? It happened because we're nurturing. See, let me put it this way. Here's an illustration. You know what the problem is that too often we treat sin as a pet while it's really a predator. We nurture it as a pet. You know, I found it interesting even thinking about this. There were some news articles just in the last week. This past week, a zookeeper at the Palm Beach County Zoo in Palm Beach County, Florida, I don't know if you saw this, she was killed by a tiger. It's the death of a woman named Stacy Conweiser. She was 38 years old. She was known as the Tiger Whisperer. She worked with tigers, and they said she loved them, and the tigers loved her, and they understood each other. And this woman who knew tigers so well was attacked this week and killed. Or you might have heard that SeaWorld has decided to stop their killer whale shows. Now, many of us, they know SeaWorld, even the very logo is a killer whale, Shamu, and we always think of that. And if you've ever been to their shows, they have these great tricks, and you know they come and they not only jump, but you can hug them and they give you a kiss, and they used to have people from the audience come up and they would give them a kiss. They would put their tongue against your cheek. Now that trainer there, a great trainer, has worked with these killer whales for years, was killed by that whale. It was a couple of years ago, and that's one of the reasons SeaWorld is doing away with their shows, because they have these, they're killer whales. We like to think that they're tame and they're pets, but they're not. Too often we look at these wild animals, these predators, and we think they're pets. It's actually a significant problem. A lot of people, you just look, and people have like tigers. They're so cute. And these are real pictures. This guy brings a tiger in his home and feeds it from the table. And boy, what a great pet. And you look at a tiger, it's so comfortable. And you talk about something that's cute to lie down and snuggle with. And what a wonderful pet. And even if you train it from the beginning, wouldn't it be great to have a tiger and you can give rides to your baby on the tiger? Now people do this. Now you say, what a great pet, right? Now maybe you don't want them in your home. They might be a little bit hard time until, house training them, and so maybe they're not great. Well, let me give you an example of a guy who was really into keeping tigers as a pet. This guy's Norman Brunwalda. He was the chairman of the Canadian Arctic or Exotic Animals Owners Association. He fought actively for the right to keep big animals as pets. Now, there was a problem in 2004 because there was a 10-year-old boy who was injured at his home when his tiger was mauled this child while they were taking a photo op for children. Now, it's wonderful, and we have kids riding on it. Well, that one time, the tiger turned around. Now, what's amazing is that it led to this huge thing, and he fought in the government, and he actually won the ability to continue to keep this tiger as a pet. And, he's known for that. Well, a couple years later, that tiger turned on him and killed him. They don't know what happened. They just came one day, and he's dead in the cage. Now, why? Because tigers are wild animals. They're vicious beasts. They're predators. And you've got to realize that when you look at this, you have these predators. We've got to realize that's what sin is. See, we have this pet sin, and we think we've got it controlled. We think, we can do it, and it's comfortable, and I can escape to that. It's just the thought. I'm not actually doing the action. I'm just thinking about, just going to pornography. I'm just going on the internet. I'm just flirting with that person. I'm just, I know the things that I watch on TV or in the movies, books I read, and, but there's nothing wrong with those. They're not sinning. And we treat them as pets. But what happens is suddenly it turns on us, and it mauls us, it destroys us, and we're thinking, what in the world happened? Where did this come from? I thought I had this controlled. I thought it was just a pet. I thought it was innocent. But suddenly this thing turns on us and destroys us because it's not a pet, it's a ruthless predator. Ruthless grace is violent because it understands that the tiger's out to destroy us. The tiger is out. The Bible says that Satan is a roaring lion seeking for someone to devour. And ruthless grace understands that. And it understands that since my problem with sin always goes back to the heart, I need to not only destroy in a ruthless grace my action, but I need to surrender my thoughts and my feelings and my desires and be just as ruthless with those as I am with the sinful action that I'm trying to fight against. It's violent. And I think that's one of the reasons that so many of us struggle and we lose this battle because we want to be violent against that sin and we don't want to do it. But you know what? We'll keep the pet of the thought. We'll keep the pet of the desires. We won't deal with, that covetousness. We won't destroy it. We won't deal with that anger. And we keep this pet and we think it's okay. And next thing you know, it turns on us. Are you willing to be ruthless? And when we realize, and why ruthless grace? Here's why. Because when we realize that the problem is my heart, there needs to be a ruthlessness where I'm willing to kill it. But you know what? I can't change my own heart. If it's my own desires, I can't change my desires. I can have some influence of changing what I think, but ultimately, it's something deeper. You know what ruthless grace means? It means that ruthless grace surrenders our sin to Christ at the cross. It recognizes that, God, here's the places that I'm struggling and I'm losing this battle. And Jesus, it's not me trying harder. It's not me somehow trying to change myself. But God, it's me admitting to you and to myself that the problem isn't only my sin. It's my thoughts. It's my act. It's my desires. It's these core issues in my life. And God, if I am going to learn to see everything through heavenly eyes, to see things from a heavenly perspective, as it says in Colossians 3, 1 and 2, then I need to see that sin is as ugly as you call it. Not only my sin, but the thoughts behind it, the desires behind it. And God, I can't keep this pet. But I admit to you it's broken. And God, I ask you to come and to kill in me that which I can't defeat myself. That sounds easy, but I'll talk to people all the time and I'll say, are you willing to surrender everything? Oh, God can't touch this. God would never change this because this is, oh, God's got to change that person before he changed this in me. And my friends, ruthless grace means that we surrender everything. That we say, God, help me to understand not only the sin that I'm battling against, but help me to understand the thoughts behind it, the emotions behind it, the desires behind it. And God, help me to see that the way that you see it, not defending it, not treating it as a pet, not thinking that somehow I can keep this and I can control it. But Father, seeing that these things are ruthless predators that are out to destroy me. And until I become ruthless, not only with the sin, but with the thoughts and attitudes behind it, until I let you kill the root, I'll never know victory. And so Jesus, I admit that, and I ask you to now change me. Take my desires. Is it hard to give up your desires? Yes, it is. Because if you say, take that desire, well, if he takes it, well, what happened? Well, I've been finding satisfaction. But God, I give you the right to take my desires. I give you the right to take my thoughts. I give you the right to take the things that I watch and the things that I read. I give you the right to take all those things and, Father, kill them and change me from the inside out. Because the victory of Christ is at the cross, where he died for our sins. And then he takes our sins and he nails them to the cross, and where he kills that in us, so that as we die to the old self, we're raised anew. And only then can we know the victory of living as the man, the woman whom God has created us to be.